In the long history of the Jedi Order, certain names carry a weight that outlasts empires, wars, and even the fall of the Republic itself. Among them, one stands apart, not for the battles fought or the enemies vanquished, but for the sheer scope of a life that stretched across ages of the galaxy most beings could never hope to witness. This is the story of Master Yoda, a being whose origins remain shrouded in mystery, whose wisdom shaped generations of Jedi, and whose journey would carry him from the golden age of the Republic through its darkest collapse, and finally, into a quiet exile, where the greatest lessons of his life were still waiting to be learned. Long before he became the face of the Jedi Council, long before younglings across the galaxy would recite his teachings as gospel, Yoda was simply a small, green-skinned child from a world that history itself seems to have forgotten. Even those who knew him best throughout his many years of service could never say with certainty where he came from. His species was never named in any archive the Jedi kept. His homeworld never charted on any star map accessible to the wider galaxy. Some believed this silence was intentional, a secret guarded so closely that even the Jedi Order's own historians dared not press for answers. Others believed the truth was simpler and stranger still, that Yoda's people existed so far beyond the reach of hyperspace lanes and Republic scouts that no one had ever stumbled upon them at all. What is remembered is that Yoda arrived at the Jedi Temple already carrying an unusually deep connection to the Force, one that set him apart, even among a population of children specifically chosen for their sensitivity to it. Jedi masters who tested him in those early days described a presence that felt older than his small frame suggested, as though something ancient and patient already lived behind his eyes. It was not unusual for Force-sensitive children to be found and brought to the temple at a very young age, but Yoda's case felt different. There was a stillness to him, an intuitive grasp of the Force that seemed to bypass the years of study most initiates required. Instructors would later say that teaching him did not feel like filling an empty vessel, but rather like helping someone remember something they had always known. The Jedi Temple in those days stood at the heart of a republic still basking in relative peace, though that peace was neither absolute nor permanent. Wars simmered at the edges of civilized space. Ancient rivalries occasionally flared into open conflict, and the memory of older, darker ages had not yet faded entirely from institutional memory. Into this world, young Yoda began the long process that would define every following stage of his life. He was placed among a clan of younglings, all much like him in that they had been taken from their birth families for a life dedicated entirely to the Force and to service. Attachment was discouraged, but community was not. And within the walls of the temple, Yoda formed the first of countless bonds that would carry him through his training. He learned quickly, absorbing lessons on the philosophy of the Force. With the same ease, he absorbed the physical forms of lightsaber combat. Despite his diminutive size and unusual appearance, Yoda distinguished himself early. His small stature might have suggested a disadvantage in a discipline built partly around dueling and physical confrontation. Yet he turned that assumption into one of his greatest strengths. His masters noted an extraordinary economy of movement in his early training, an instinct for using minimal effort to achieve maximum effect, whether guiding a training remote's blaster bolt aside or redirecting the momentum of a much larger sparring partner. It was as though his body had been shaped specifically to embody one of the oldest truths taught within the Order, that size and strength alone were never the measure of a Jedi's power. As the years passed, Yoda advanced from initiate to Padawan under the guidance of a master whose own name has been lost to the fog of Jedi history. An irony not lost on those who study his life today, given how central Yoda himself would later become to shaping the training of nearly everyone within the Order. What remains clear is that his apprenticeship was thorough, disciplined, and unusually long even by Jedi standards, stretching across a period during which the wider galaxy underwent significant upheaval. The Republic he served was neither static nor uniformly peaceful. Small wars flared and faded on the outer rim. Ancient enemies occasionally resurfaced from the shadows of history, testing the resolve of the Jedi tasked with maintaining balance. Through each of these trials, Yoda's reputation grew, not through boastful displays of power, but through quiet, consistent competence that impressed even the most skeptical of his peers. It was during this era that Yoda first crossed paths with beings whose names would later echo throughout galactic history. Fellow Padawans who trained alongside him would go on to become legendary Jedi Masters in their own right. Generals, diplomats, and philosophers whose combined efforts helped define the Order's identity for centuries to come. Yoda's relationships with these contemporaries were often described as warm but measured, marked by the same patient wisdom that would characterize his entire life. Even as a younger Jedi, he possessed an unusual gift for seeing the larger picture in any conflict, for understanding not just the immediate tactical situation but the deeper currents of the Force that shaped it. This gift did not go unnoticed by the Council, and it was not long before Yoda was granted the rank of Jedi Knight, a milestone that many of his peers considered inevitable long before it officially arrived. What followed was a period often described by Jedi historians as Yoda's wandering years, though the term belies the seriousness of the work he undertook during this time. As a knight, he was dispatched across the galaxy on missions that ranged from diplomatic negotiations between feuding star systems to direct intervention against emerging threats tied to the dark side of the Force. He served as mediator in disputes that might otherwise have escalated into full-scale war, using patience and careful listening rather than displays of power to bring resolution. He also found himself, on more than one occasion, facing down remnants of ancient evils that had lain dormant for generations, only to stir once again as the galaxy's political landscape shifted. These missions shaped Yoda profoundly. Unlike Jedi, who spent their careers in more insulated roles, close to the temple and its structured hierarchy, Yoda's early years as a knight exposed him to the full breadth of suffering and complexity that existed beyond the Order's walls. He witnessed firsthand how power could corrupt even the most well-intentioned beings, how fear could twist entire societies toward violence, and how the smallest acts of compassion could sometimes accomplish what armies could not. It was in these years that the philosophy he would later become famous for teaching, that fear leads to anger, that anger leads to hatred, that hatred leads to suffering, began to crystallize, not as abstract doctrine, but as lived, painfully earned truth. As word of his exploits spread, Yoda's reputation within the Order continued to grow, though he remained famously humble about his own accomplishments. Colleagues who served alongside him during this period often remarked on his reluctance to take credit for successful missions, preferring instead to highlight the contributions of those who fought beside him. This humility, paired with his evident skill and wisdom, made him a natural candidate for greater responsibility within the Jedi hierarchy. Yet, Yoda himself seemed in no hurry to to seek out positions of authority. He continued to accept field assignments long after many of his peers had transitioned into more administrative or teaching roles, content to remain close to the actual practice of being a Jedi rather than retreating into the comforts of temple life. It was during a period of significant galactic instability that Yoda's true value to the Order became undeniable. A conflict, remembered by later generations as one of the most devastating wars the Republic had faced in living memory at that time, drew Jedi from across known space into direct combat against forces steeped in the dark side. Yoda found himself at the heart of this struggle, coordinating strategy between scattered Jedi strike teams, negotiating fragile alliances between Republic worlds, wary of committing their own defenses, and, when necessary, meeting enemies directly in combat. Those who fought alongside him during this era described a warrior of astonishing capability, one whose skill with a lightsaber was matched only by his mastery of the Force itself. He moved through battle, not with reckless aggression but with an almost serene focus, seeming to anticipate his opponent's actions before they themselves had fully committed to them. The war eventually came to an end, as all wars do, though not without significant cost, to both the Republic and the Jedi Order. Temples were damaged, ancient records lost, and many promising young Jedi fell in service to a cause they believed in absolutely. Yoda, who survived the conflict largely unscathed physically, carried deeper scars that few ever saw. He rarely spoke of specific battles or losses from this period, though those closest to him noted a growing gravity in his demeanor following the war's conclusion. It was as though each conflict he survived added another layer of quiet sorrow beneath his characteristic patience, a sorrow he channeled not into bitterness but into an ever-deepening commitment to preventing such devastation wherever possible. In the relative peace that followed, Yoda transitioned more fully into a teaching role within the temple, training the next generation of Jedi, even as he continued to accept occasional field assignments when circumstances demanded his particular expertise. His teaching style quickly became the stuff of legend among younglings and Padawans alike. Unlike instructors who relied heavily on rote memorization or rigid adherence to established forms, Yoda favored a more intuitive, almost Socratic approach, guiding students toward their own understanding rather than simply providing answers outright. He was known to answer a student's earnest question with another question entirely, forcing them to examine their own assumptions before arriving at true comprehension. This method frustrated some students initially, but those who persevered often described it as the most transformative education they received throughout their entire time at the temple. Word of Yoda's unique teaching gifts spread throughout the Order, and it was not long before he was formally recognized as a Jedi Master, a title that came with both increased responsibility and increased scrutiny. As a master, he took on Padawans of his own, shaping their development with the same patient, unconventional wisdom that had defined his own approach to teaching younger students. Each Padawan he trained went on to distinguish themselves within the Order in different ways, a testament to Yoda's ability to recognize and nurture the unique strengths of each individual rather than forcing every student into an identical mold. Some became renowned diplomats, others skilled warriors, still others quiet scholars, who preserved and expanded the Order's understanding of the Force itself. Through them, Yoda's influence began to ripple outward across the galaxy in ways even he could not have fully anticipated. As the decades continued to pass, and then the centuries, Yoda's role within the Jedi Order steadily expanded. he became a fixture on the Jedi Council, one of the select group of masters entrusted with guiding the Order's overall direction and making the most difficult decisions regarding galactic affairs. His counsel was sought not only on matters directly related to Jedi training or Force philosophy, but increasingly on broader questions of galactic politics, diplomacy, and strategy. Senators and diplomats from across the Republic came to value his perspective, recognizing in him a wisdom that transcended simple political calculation. He seemed able to see the deeper currents beneath even the most complex political disputes, offering guidance that balanced immediate practical concerns with a longer view of consequences that might unfold across generations. Yet even as his stature grew, Yoda never lost the essential humility that had defined him since his earliest days as a Padawan. Colleagues who served alongside him on the council often remarked on his willingness to defer to the judgment of others, even junior members. When he believed their perspective offered genuine insight he himself lacked. He approached leadership not as a position of authority to be wielded, but as a responsibility to be carried carefully, with constant awareness of how easily power could distort judgment if left unchecked. This awareness would prove prescient in ways that Yoda himself likely could not have fully anticipated during these relatively stable years of his long service. The Republic during this era enjoyed what many historians would later describe as something of a golden age, a period of sustained peace and prosperity following the resolution of major conflicts that had scarred earlier generations. Trade flourished between star systems. New worlds were settled and integrated into the galactic community. The Jedi Order, having weathered its most difficult trials, settled into a role that felt, for a time, almost comfortably established. Temples across the galaxy trained new generations of Jedi in relative safety, free from the immediate pressures of large-scale warfare that had defined so much of the Order's more distant history. But peace, as Yoda understood better than most, is rarely permanent, and comfort has a way of dulling vigilance even among those most committed to maintaining balance. In the quiet corridors of power, both within the Republic Senate and in shadows far beyond the reach of Jedi awareness, forces were already beginning to stir that would eventually challenge everything the Order believed itself to understand about the nature of its ancient enemy. The Sith, believed by most within the Jedi Order to have been extinguished many generations earlier, had not vanished at all. They had merely learned patience, adapting a strategy of concealment and long-term planning that would prove far more dangerous than the open warfare of earlier eras. Yoda, for all his wisdom, remained largely unaware of the full scope of this hidden threat during these years, though there were moments when a subtle unease seemed to trouble his usually serene countenance. He spoke, on occasion, of disturbances in the Force that he could not fully explain, patterns that seemed to suggest something was shifting beneath the surface of galactic events, even as no concrete evidence of Sith activity presented itself to the Council. Some of his fellow masters dismissed these concerns as the natural caution of an aging Jedi who had witnessed too much conflict to fully trust in lasting peace. Others took his warnings more seriously, though without clear direction for where such threats might originate. There was little concrete action the Council could take beyond maintaining their usual vigilance. It was during this period that Yoda's role as Grand Master of the Jedi Order became formalized, a recognition of the singular position he had come to occupy within the institution's leadership. As Grand Master, he bore ultimate responsibility for guiding the Council's decisions and for representing the Order's interests in its dealings with the Republic Senate and other galactic powers. It was a role that demanded not only wisdom, but an almost superhuman capacity for patience, given the often glacial pace of political negotiation and the competing interests that constantly threatened to pull the Republic's vast bureaucracy in conflicting directions. Yoda navigated these challenges with characteristic grace, though those closest to him noted the toll such responsibilities took, even on someone of his considerable inner strength. Throughout this era of relative stability, Yoda continued training new generations of Padawans, each carrying forward some fragment of his teachings into their own service throughout the galaxy. He remained a constant presence at the temple on Coruscant, a figure whose small stature belied the immense respect he commanded from Jedi of every rank. Younglings would often seek him out simply to sit in his presence, drawn by a calm they could not fully articulate, but instinctively understood as a kind of deep alignment with the Force itself. He welcomed these interactions warmly, never too consumed by his greater responsibilities to offer guidance to even the youngest members of the Order. Yet beneath the surface calm of this golden age, the seeds of future catastrophe were already being planted, though few beyond the shadows themselves could perceive it. A young Jedi Master, brilliant and deeply respected within the Order, would eventually walk a path that led him away from the light entirely. His fall from grace serving as one of the earliest and most painful warnings that the Jedi Order's understanding of its own vulnerabilities remained dangerously incomplete. Yoda, who had trained and mentored countless Jedi throughout his long service, would find himself confronting the reality that even the most promising students could fall prey to doubt, ambition, and the subtle whispers of the dark side if the right combination of circumstances aligned against them. This particular fall, when it eventually came, sent ripples of concern throughout the council that Yoda took especially seriously. He had always believed, perhaps more than most of his colleagues, that the greatest threats to the Jedi Order would not come from external enemies alone, but from internal weaknesses left unaddressed. The loss of a Jedi to the dark side represented precisely the kind of internal failure he had long feared, a reminder that wisdom and power alone could never fully guarantee resistance to temptation. In the aftermath, Yoda advocated for renewed attention to the emotional and psychological well-being of Jedi throughout their training, arguing that technical mastery of the Force meant little if a Jedi's inner life remained unexamined and unstable. Despite these concerns, the broader council largely maintained confidence in the Order's established methods and traditions. The Republic continued to enjoy prosperity, and with few signs of imminent, large-scale conflict, there seemed little urgency to overhaul systems that had served the Jedi well across many generations. Yoda, ever respectful of collective decision-making, even when his own instincts urged greater caution, deferred to the Council's broader judgment, while continuing to quietly implement whatever changes lay within his own authority as a teacher and mentor. He began placing greater emphasis in his own instruction on emotional discipline and self-awareness, alongside the more traditional lessons of force manipulation and lightsaber combat, hoping to instill in his own students a resilience that might protect them from the kind of slow corruption that had claimed others. As the years continued to accumulate, Yoda's presence within the Jedi Order took on an almost mythic quality, even among those who served alongside him daily. Younger Jedi, born generations after his own arrival at the temple, grew up hearing stories of his exploits during earlier conflicts, tales that had, by this point, taken on the embellished quality of legend, even when grounded in genuine historical fact. Yoda himself seemed largely indifferent to this growing mythology, continuing to conduct himself with the same humble dedication to duty that had characterized his entire life. He rarely spoke of his own past achievements unless directly relevant to a lesson he hoped to impart, preferring instead to focus his attention fully on the present needs of those under his guidance. It was also during this extended period of service that Yoda developed particularly close relationships with several Jedi who would go on to play significant roles in the tumultuous events still waiting on the horizon, though none of them, Yoda included, could have fully anticipated just how central those events would become to the fate of the entire galaxy. Among these relationships, one in particular would come to carry profound significance in the years ahead, a bond between Yoda and a gifted young Jedi whose exceptional abilities and complicated relationship with the Order's traditions would eventually place him at the center of a crisis unlike anything the Jedi had faced in generations. This Jedi, trained partly under Yoda's own guidance during certain phases of his development, possessed a combination of raw talent and independent thinking that both impressed and, at times, concerned his teachers. Yoda recognized early the singular capability this student possessed, an aptitude for the Force that rivaled even the most gifted Jedi of previous generations. Yet Yoda also perceived, with the same intuitive clarity that had guided so much of his own long life, a restlessness in this student, a tendency to question established Jedi philosophy in ways that occasionally bordered on outright defiance. Rather than attempting to suppress this independent streak entirely, Yoda encouraged its more productive expressions while gently steering the young Jedi away from paths that seemed to risk drifting too far from the Order's core principles. The relationship between master and student during this period was complex, marked by moments of genuine mutual respect alongside periods of significant tension. This particular Jedi would eventually leave the Order entirely, a departure that troubled Yoda deeply, though he never spoke publicly of any regret regarding how the relationship had unfolded. In private, however, those closest to Yoda during this time noted a particular weariness whenever the subject arose, as though this loss represented, for him, a preview of challenges the Order would need to confront more directly in the years still to come. The eventual return of this same Jedi years later, transformed by experiences far beyond the walls of the temple, would carry consequences that reached far beyond what anyone within the Council could have predicted at the time of his original departure. Meanwhile, the political landscape of the Republic itself began undergoing gradual but significant shifts, changes that unfolded slowly enough that few beyond the most perceptive observers noticed their full implications until much later. Trade disputes between powerful commercial entities and struggling outer rim territories grew increasingly tense. Bureaucratic gridlock within the Senate made even routine governance increasingly difficult, fueling growing frustration among constituencies across the galaxy who felt increasingly disconnected from the distant halls of power on Coruscant. Yoda, attuned as always to broader currents within the Force, sensed a growing unease rippling through the galaxy's collective consciousness. Though the precise source of this unease remained frustratingly difficult to identify or articulate to his fellow council members, it was against this backdrop of gradual, almost imperceptible decline that a particular young senator began rising through the ranks of Republic politics, a figure whose charisma and apparent dedication to reform earned him widespread admiration across a broad political spectrum. Yoda, along with the rest of the Jedi Council, had little reason at this stage to view this rising political figure with any particular suspicion. He appeared, by every outward measure, to be exactly what the struggling Republic needed: a passionate advocate for change who seemed genuinely committed to addressing the systemic dysfunction that had come to define so much of galactic governance. Few among the Jedi, Yoda included, could have imagined the true nature of the figure operating so carefully behind this carefully constructed public persona. As tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface of Republic politics, Yoda found himself increasingly occupied with matters that demanded his full attention as Grand Master, even as that subtle unease within the Force continued to trouble him during quiet moments of meditation. He began spending increasing amounts of time in contemplation, seeking clarity regarding the source of these disturbances, though the answers he sought remained frustratingly elusive. The dark side, he had long taught his students, often concealed itself most effectively not through direct confrontation but through patient, gradual corruption that avoided detection precisely because it unfolded so slowly that those experiencing it rarely recognized the transformation taking place around them. This principle, one Yoda had taught countless students throughout his centuries of service, was about to be tested in ways far more personal and immediate than he could have anticipated, as the galaxy inexorably approached a crisis that would eventually consume the very order Yoda had dedicated his entire long life to serving and protecting. The disturbance Yoda sensed was not, as it turned out, a single isolated event, but rather the culmination of decades, perhaps even centuries, of patient, hidden scheming carried out by an enemy the Jedi Order had long believed extinct. Deep within the shadows of Republic society, a Sith Lord had been quietly rebuilding what centuries of Jedi vigilance had once nearly destroyed, operating not through open warfare but through infiltration, manipulation, and the careful cultivation of chaos that could later be exploited for calculated advantage. Yoda, along with every other member of the Jedi Council, remained almost entirely unaware of just how deeply this hidden influence had already permeated the highest levels of Republic government by the time the first unmistakable signs of the enemy's return finally surfaced. That surfacing came, as such things often do, not through grand revelation, but through a single, seemingly isolated confrontation that would nonetheless send shockwaves throughout the entire Jedi Order. A trade dispute involving a peaceful world on the edges of the Republic escalated unexpectedly into open blockade and eventual invasion, drawing the attention of two Jedi dispatched to negotiate a peaceful resolution. What began as a routine diplomatic mission quickly spiraled into something far more significant, culminating in direct combat against a mysterious figure wielding a lightsaber of design and skill unlike anything the Jedi had encountered in living memory. When word reached the temple that this mysterious assailant identified himself, in the moments before disappearing back into the shadows as a Sith Lord, the news struck the Council with the force of a physical blow. Yoda received this report with the same outward composure that had defined his response to crisis throughout his entire long life, though those present in the Council chamber that day would later recall a particular gravity settling over him as the implications of this revelation became clear. For generations, the Jedi Order had operated under the confident assumption that the Sith had been eliminated entirely, their ancient philosophy and dangerous teachings relegated permanently to the pages of history. That assumption, it now seemed undeniable, had been catastrophically mistaken. Somewhere, hidden from even the Order's most perceptive members, an entire tradition of dark side practitioners had survived. patient enough to wait generations for the opportunity to re-emerge. The council convened extensively in the days and weeks that followed this revelation, debating not only the immediate practical question of how to respond to this newly confirmed threat, but the far more troubling question of how such a threat could have gone undetected for so long. Yoda, drawing on centuries of accumulated wisdom, offered a perspective that few of his younger colleagues had fully considered. The Sith, he suggested, had likely abandoned the aggressive, expansionist strategies that had characterized their earlier conflicts with the Republic, recognizing that such open confrontation had ultimately led to their apparent destruction. Instead, they had adopted patience as their primary weapon, operating in secret, cultivating influence gradually, waiting for a moment when the Republic's own internal weaknesses might create an opportunity too significant to resist. This theory, unsettling as it was, offered little immediate comfort in terms of identifying the specific threat now operating somewhere within or near the halls of galactic power. The Jedi assigned to investigate the confrontation continued their efforts, eventually uncovering connections between the mysterious Sith Lord and a growing conspiracy involving the very Trade Federation whose dispute had precipitated the original crisis. As this investigation unfolded, it revealed a Force-sensitive child living in servitude on a distant desert world, a boy whose connection to the Force registered at levels so extraordinary that the Jedi who first encountered him struggled to comprehend the readings from their own equipment. When this boy was eventually brought before the Council for formal evaluation, Yoda found himself confronting one of the most difficult decisions of his entire long tenure as Grand Master. The boy's abilities were undeniable, a connection to the Force so profound that some among the Council speculated he might represent the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy long debated within Jedi philosophical circles, a prophecy concerning a chosen one destined to restore balance to the Force itself. Yet the boy's age presented a significant obstacle to traditional Jedi training, which had long emphasized beginning instruction while children were still quite young, before attachments and emotional patterns had fully solidified. More troubling still, Yoda sensed within the boy an undercurrent of fear, a quality that ran directly counter to everything the Jedi philosophy taught regarding the dangers of fear as a gateway toward the dark side. The debate that followed within the council chamber grew heated, with several masters advocating strongly in favor of accepting the boy for training, citing both his extraordinary potential and the moral obligation many felt toward a child who had spent his early years in bondage. Yoda listened carefully to these arguments, weighing them against his own deep unease, an unease rooted not in doubt regarding the boy's power, but in genuine concern regarding the path such power might ultimately take, if not carefully and completely guided. In the end, despite his reservations, Yoda found himself outvoted by colleagues whose optimism and compassion, however well-intentioned, would later prove to have overlooked warning signs that Yoda's own instincts had correctly identified from the very beginning. The boy was eventually accepted into the Order, training not under Yoda directly, but under the guidance of the very Jedi who had first discovered him. A decision that would carry consequences reaching far beyond what anyone present in that council chamber could have fully anticipated. Yoda continued to observe the boy's progress from a respectful distance throughout the following years, offering guidance when specifically consulted, but largely deferring to the judgment of the Jedi directly responsible for his training. Even as this remarkable student demonstrated skill and power that seemed to confirm every hope placed in him, Yoda's underlying unease never fully dissipated, a quiet vigilance that he maintained privately, even as public confidence in the boy's destiny grew increasingly widespread throughout the Order. Meanwhile, the broader political crisis that had first brought this extraordinary child to the Jedi's attention resolved itself in a manner that appeared, on the surface, to represent a clear victory for the Republic and its values. The invasion that had threatened an entire peaceful world was repelled, the political maneuvering behind it exposed and condemned, and the young senator, who had risen to prominence through his passionate advocacy during this crisis, found himself elevated to the highest political office the Republic could offer. Yoda, along with the rest of the Council, viewed this outcome with cautious optimism, hopeful that new leadership might help address the systemic dysfunction that had plagued Republic governance for so long. None among them recognized, in that moment of apparent triumph, that they had witnessed not the defeat of their ancient enemy but merely the opening move in a far more elaborate and patient scheme that had been unfolding for considerably longer than anyone within the Jedi Order yet understood. The years that followed brought a deceptive calm to galactic affairs, though beneath this surface tranquility, tensions continued to accumulate in ways that would eventually prove impossible to contain. Yoda continued his duties as Grand Master, with characteristic dedication, training new generations of Jedi, offering counsel on matters both large and small, and maintaining his quiet vigilance regarding the disturbances he continued to sense within the Force, disturbances that never fully resolved despite the apparent political victory that had seemingly addressed the immediate crisis. He spoke of these lingering concerns periodically to his fellow council members, though without concrete evidence of ongoing threat, there remained little actionable response the Order could pursue beyond maintaining their usual watchfulness. During this period, Yoda also found himself increasingly involved in monitoring the progress of the young Jedi, whose training had begun under such extraordinary and controversial circumstances. Though he maintained his characteristic patience and outward composure, private conversations with trusted colleagues revealed a master whose concerns had, if anything, deepened rather than diminished as the years passed. The bond between this young Jedi and his primary teacher had grown remarkably close, closer perhaps than traditional Jedi philosophy generally recommended, given the Order's long-standing emphasis on avoiding attachments that might compromise a Jedi's judgment during moments of crisis. Yoda observed this dynamic with growing unease, recognizing patterns that echoed concerns he had voiced from the very beginning of this particular student's training, though he continued to defer to his colleagues' judgment regarding the specifics of the young man's day-to-day instruction. As political tensions within the Republic continued their slow but steady escalation, disputes between star systems grew increasingly difficult to resolve through traditional diplomatic channels. Separatist sentiment began spreading across various sectors of the galaxy, fueled by genuine grievances regarding taxation, representation, and the Republic's apparent inability to address the needs of its more distant territories. Yoda watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing in this fragmentation echoes of patterns that had historically preceded larger conflicts throughout galactic history. He advocated repeatedly for renewed diplomatic engagement, for genuine efforts to address the underlying grievances driving this separatist movement before the situation escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. His counsel, though respected, often found itself constrained by the practical limitations of Jedi authority within a republic that remained, at its core, a democratic institution governed by its elected representatives and their often conflicting priorities. Yoda understood these limitations well, having navigated the delicate balance between Jedi influence and Republic governance throughout centuries of service. Yet the growing scale of the crisis now unfolding tested even his considerable patience and diplomatic skill. Behind the scenes, forces continued working to exacerbate these tensions rather than resolve them. Though the full extent of this hidden manipulation remained invisible even to Yoda's carefully attuned senses, the crisis eventually reached a breaking point when an assassination attempt targeted a prominent senator whose political stance had made her a particular target for those seeking to escalate rather than diffuse the Republic's mounting internal divisions. This attempt, though ultimately unsuccessful, set into motion a chain of events that would soon draw Yoda's most trusted former student, along with the extraordinary young Jedi whose training had begun under such fraught circumstances years earlier, into direct investigation of a conspiracy whose roots extended far deeper than anyone within the Jedi Order yet suspected. As this investigation unfolded, it revealed the existence of a massive, secretly commissioned army, one whose origins traced back through a bewildering series of manipulations that seemed designed specifically to leave the Jedi Order with no viable alternative but to accept and deploy this mysterious military force in defense of the Republic. Yoda, upon learning the full scope of what had been uncovered, felt the weight of this revelation settle over him with particular heaviness. Here, finally, was concrete evidence of the patient, hidden scheme he had sensed disturbing the Force for years without ever being able to fully identify its source or nature. Yet even with this evidence now before the Council, the practical options available to the Jedi Order had narrowed dramatically, seemingly by design. A separatist movement, now revealed to possess its own substantial military capability, stood poised to plunge the galaxy into open warfare. The only force capable of matching this threat happened to be the very army whose mysterious origins now raised such troubling questions about who, precisely, had commissioned its creation and why. Faced with this impossible dilemma, the Council made the fateful decision to accept command of this newly discovered army, a decision that would transform the Jedi Order from an institution of diplomats and peacekeepers into military commanders leading soldiers into a war whose true architects remained hidden from view. Yoda himself would soon find himself directly commanding troops in combat for the first time in generations, a role that sat uneasily alongside everything he had spent his long life teaching regarding the dangers of violence and the importance of seeking peaceful resolution wherever possible. Yet with the galaxy's stability hanging in the balance, and with separatist forces already moving toward open confrontation, there seemed no alternative path available that might avoid the devastating conflict now bearing down upon the Republic with terrible inevitability. The war that followed would test Yoda and every Jedi under his guidance in ways that none of them could have fully anticipated, even amid their gravest concerns during the years of rising tension that had preceded this catastrophic outbreak of violence. Battles erupted across countless worlds, drawing Jedi away from their traditional roles as guardians of peace and into direct command of massive military campaigns. Yoda found himself dispatched to numerous critical engagements throughout this conflict, his tactical brilliance and deep connection to the Force proving instrumental in securing crucial victories even as the broader war continued to grind on with devastating cost to both sides. He led troops with the same careful, patient wisdom that had characterized his approach to every challenge throughout his long life, though the fundamental nature of warfare itself often left little room for the kind of nuanced, contemplative decision-making he had always preferred. Throughout this brutal conflict, Yoda continued to sense that something remained deeply wrong beneath the surface of events. A persistent unease that the war itself, despite its obvious horrors, did not fully explain. He maintained his vigilance even amid the chaos of battle, seeking clarity regarding the true architects of this conflict and their ultimate objectives, though answers continued to elude him even as years of warfare stretched on with no clear resolution in sight. The Chancellor, whose rise to power had once seemed to promise genuine reform, now wielded increasingly expansive emergency powers, justified by the demands of wartime necessity, a development that troubled Yoda deeply, even as he struggled to articulate precisely why such expanded authority felt so dangerous within the context of a republic ostensibly still governed by its traditional democratic institutions. As the war dragged into its later stages, Yoda found himself increasingly troubled by the changing nature of the young Jedi he had watched grow from a frightened, extraordinarily gifted child into one of the Order's most celebrated warriors. This young man's exploits on the battlefield had become the stuff of legend throughout the ranks of both Jedi and clone soldiers alike, his skill in combat unmatched by nearly anyone else within the Order's ranks. Yet alongside these battlefield triumphs, Yoda perceived a growing volatility in the young Jedi's temperament, an increasing willingness to bend or outright abandon traditional Jedi principles when circumstances seemed to demand more forceful action. Reports occasionally reached the Council describing incidents where restraint had given way to something closer to rage. Moments that troubled Yoda precisely because they echoed patterns he recognized from his centuries of studying. How promising individuals could gradually drift toward the dark side, without ever consciously choosing that path in any single, identifiable moment. Yoda raised these concerns periodically within council discussions, though he found himself, once again, navigating the difficult position of voicing caution regarding a Jedi whose battlefield contributions remained undeniably valuable to the ongoing war effort. His former student and closest friend within the Order, who had trained this young Jedi from childhood and maintained a bond with him that had only deepened through years of shared combat, remained largely resistant to Yoda's warnings, viewing them as excessive caution regarding a Jedi whose loyalty and dedication to the Order seemed, on the surface, entirely beyond question. This disagreement created a subtle but persistent tension between two of the Order's most respected masters, one that neither fully resolved, even as the war continued its relentless progression toward an outcome none of them could yet foresee. Compounding these concerns, Yoda began noticing troubling patterns in how the young Jedi related to those closest to him, patterns that suggested attachments running far deeper than traditional Jedi philosophy generally permitted. Though the specific nature of these attachments remained hidden from most within the Council, Yoda's own carefully honed sensitivity to disturbances in the Force occasionally registered fluctuations he associated with precisely this kind of dangerous emotional entanglement. He considered raising these concerns more directly, yet the pressing demands of an increasingly desperate war effort left little time or opportunity for the kind of careful, personal intervention such a delicate situation seemed to require. This hesitation, born from practical necessity rather than any failure of wisdom, would later prove to be one of the most consequential missed opportunities of Yoda's entire long career as Grand Master. Meanwhile, the war itself continued grinding forward with devastating cost. draining resources and lives across countless worlds, while somehow never quite reaching the decisive conclusion that might have finally brought the conflict to an end. Yoda increasingly suspected that this prolonged stalemate was not accidental, but rather represented a deliberate strategy orchestrated by unseen forces who benefited from the Republic's continued distraction and gradual erosion of its traditional democratic institutions. Each new emergency measure, enacted in the name of wartime necessity, further concentrated authority within the Chancellor's office, a pattern that Yoda watched with mounting alarm even as he struggled to identify any specific action that might justify direct Jedi intervention against a democratically elected and widely popular leader. It was during a mission investigating one of the more mysterious threads connecting various separatist activities that Yoda finally began piecing together fragments of a truth that had eluded the entire Jedi Order for years. Ancient teachings regarding the traditional structure of Sith organization, involving always exactly two practitioners, a master and an apprentice, suggested a possibility that Yoda found himself unable to dismiss, no matter how uncomfortable its implications proved to be. If the Sith had indeed survived in secret according to this traditional structure, then somewhere within the highest circles of galactic power, hidden behind an identity trusted implicitly by nearly everyone who encountered him, a Sith Master might be operating with an influence and reach that made him uniquely capable of orchestrating events on the galaxy-spanning scale that recent history had demonstrated. This suspicion, once formed, proved impossible for Yoda to fully set aside, though concrete evidence supporting such an extraordinary claim remained frustratingly elusive throughout the following months of continued warfare. He shared his growing suspicions carefully with a small circle of trusted colleagues, urging heightened vigilance regarding anyone within the upper echelons of Republic government whose influence and authority might align with what such a hidden Sith Master would require to operate so effectively while remaining entirely undetected. Yet without more concrete evidence, pursuing such suspicions risked destabilizing an already fragile wartime governing structure, a risk that Yoda, ever mindful of unintended consequences, remained reluctant to take without considerably more certainty than his instincts alone could provide. As the war approached what many hoped might finally be its concluding phase, Yoda found himself dispatched to a distant world to lead a critical campaign against separatist forces entrenched in a heavily fortified position. This assignment, seemingly routine given the countless similar engagements he had led throughout the preceding years of conflict, would ultimately separate him from the heart of galactic power at precisely the moment when the true architect of this entire devastating war finally chose to reveal his hand and set into motion the final phase of a scheme that had been unfolding patiently for longer than even Yoda's darkest suspicions had ever fully grasped. The battle itself proved fierce, testing Yoda's tactical skill and connection to the Force against defenses more formidable than nearly anything he had encountered throughout the entire war. He led the assault with characteristic patience and precision, coordinating clone forces under his command with the kind of careful, strategic thinking that had defined his approach to every conflict throughout his long life. Victory, when it finally came, arrived at considerable cost, though Yoda's forces ultimately succeeded in overwhelming the separatist stronghold and securing a crucial strategic objective that seemed to bring the galaxy meaningfully closer to the war's long-awaited conclusion. Yet even amid this hard-won triumph, Yoda felt a familiar unease settling over him. an instinct honed across centuries of service, warning him that something remained fundamentally wrong beneath the surface of this apparent victory. He found himself unable to fully articulate the source of this disturbance, though its intensity exceeded anything he had experienced even during the darkest moments of the preceding years of warfare. Seeking clarity, he retreated into deep meditation amid the aftermath of battle, attempting to trace the source of this overwhelming sense of impending catastrophe that seemed to radiate through the Force itself with an intensity he had rarely, if ever, encountered throughout his entire extraordinarily long life. What Yoda sensed in those critical moments of meditation would prove to be the opening movements of a catastrophe that had been meticulously planned for longer than the war itself had lasted, a final, devastating betrayal orchestrated by an enemy who had successfully concealed his true identity from the entire Jedi Order across years of increasingly close proximity to its most trusted institutions. The disturbance Yoda felt was not a single event, but rather the beginning of something far more comprehensive, a coordinated strike designed to eliminate the Jedi Order entirely in a single, devastating stroke executed simultaneously across countless worlds throughout the galaxy. As this terrible realization began crystallizing within his consciousness, Yoda found himself confronting the horrifying possibility that everything he had sensed, feared, and struggled to fully understand across the preceding years had been building toward this singular, catastrophic moment, one that even his considerable wisdom and centuries of accumulated experience had failed to fully anticipate or prevent. In the space of a single, suspended heartbeat, Yoda felt the Force itself seemed to shudder, as though countless small flames that had burned steadily for generations were being extinguished all at once across the breadth of the galaxy. He had spent centuries learning to read the subtle currents that flowed through all living things, had trained himself across a lifetime longer than nearly any being he had ever encountered, to remain calm amid crisis, patient amid uncertainty, and steady amid fear. Yet nothing in all those centuries of discipline had prepared him for the sheer scale of what he now sensed unfolding, a wave of loss so vast and so sudden that it threatened to overwhelm even his most carefully cultivated composure. Around him, the clone troopers who had fought alongside him through countless engagements, who had trusted his leadership and followed his commands without hesitation across years of brutal warfare, remained utterly unaware of the silent, hidden command that had just been transmitted to every corner of the galaxy, a command that would transform trusted comrades into instruments of betrayal within the span of a single terrible moment. Yoda, sensing the shift in the Force around him just seconds before it fully manifested, would soon find himself fighting not against the separatist enemies he had spent years battling, but against soldiers who had marched beside him in loyal service only moments before, their sudden and inexplicable turn against him, marking the beginning of the most devastating chapter in the entire long history of the Jedi Order, one that would test everything Yoda had ever believed about duty, survival, and the terrible cost of failing to see danger clearly enough, soon enough, to prevent catastrophe from arriving at last. Whatever came next would demand of Yoda a strength unlike any he had needed before. Not the strength of a warrior facing a familiar battlefield, but the strength of a being forced, in a single unbearable instant, to accept that the world he had spent nearly his entire impossibly long life building, protecting, and believing in was already, irrevocably, coming apart around him. The betrayal, when it fully arrived, struck with a speed that left no room for hesitation or disbelief. Around Yoda, soldiers who had marched beside him through countless engagements, who had trusted his judgment and followed his every command without question, turned their weapons against him in perfect, eerie unison, their faces hidden behind the same familiar helmets that had once signaled comradeship and now signaled something far darker. There was no warning shouted, no moment of visible internal struggle among the men carrying out this sudden assault. It was as though some hidden switch, buried deep within their conditioning from the moment of their creation, had simply been thrown, transforming loyal soldiers into instruments of a will none of them consciously understood or questioned. Yoda's lightsaber ignited before conscious thought could fully catch up with instinct. Decades upon decades of combat experience taking over, in the instant his body registered the threat surrounding him. He moved through the chaos with the same economy of motion that had characterized his fighting style since his earliest years as a Padawan, deflecting blaster fire, disarming attackers with minimal but devastatingly precise strikes, all while his mind raced to comprehend the full scope of what was happening not just around him, but, as he now understood with sickening clarity, across the entire galaxy simultaneously. This was not an isolated mutiny. This was something coordinated, something that had been planted deep within the very foundation of the army. The Jedi Order had unknowingly accepted years earlier, waiting patiently for the precise moment when a single command could transform an entire military force into an instrument of the Order's total destruction. He survived that initial assault, cutting through the confusion with a combination of combat mastery and force-guided instinct that allowed him to escape the immediate danger. Though escape brought little comfort given what he now understood was unfolding simultaneously on nearly every world where Jedi commanders led their own clone battalions into what had, in an instant, become deadly ambushes rather than continued campaigns against a common enemy. As he fled toward available transport, Yoda reached out through the Force, desperately searching for any sense of his fellow Jedi scattered across the galaxy, and found instead an overwhelming, sickening silence where countless familiar presences had, only moments before, still burned brightly within the living currents that connected all Force-sensitive beings to one another. The scale of loss was almost impossible for even Yoda's centuries-honed mind to fully process in those first disorienting hours. Jedi he had trained personally, colleagues who had served alongside him through generations of both peace and war, younglings who had barely begun their journey toward becoming full Jedi Knights, all of them extinguished within the same coordinated strike, their individual presences within the Force simply ceasing to exist, within the span of what felt like a single, endless, unbearable moment. Yoda had witnessed devastating losses throughout his long life, had mourned countless companions across centuries of service, yet nothing in all that accumulated experience had prepared him for grief on a scale this total, this immediate, and this deliberately, methodically orchestrated. Amid this catastrophic devastation, Yoda's thoughts turned immediately toward the temple on Coruscant, the beating heart of the Jedi Order. And, he now feared with growing dread, likely a primary target for whatever remained of this coordinated assault beyond the battlefield. Betrayals already unfolding across countless worlds, securing transport through channels that remained loyal, or at least not yet compromised by whatever hidden command had triggered this catastrophe. Yoda began the desperate journey back toward Coruscant, uncertain what, if anything, might remain of the institution he had spent his entire impossibly long life serving and protecting by the time he finally arrived. The journey itself passed in a haze of grief and grim determination. Yoda, using every moment of transit to steady himself through deep meditation, seeking not escape from the horror unfolding around him, but rather the clarity necessary to respond effectively to whatever awaited him upon arrival. He understood, with the terrible certainty that only decades of hard-won wisdom could provide, that whoever had orchestrated this catastrophe had done so with meticulous, patient planning that likely extended far beyond the immediate military betrayal now claiming Jedi lives across the galaxy. This was not merely an attack. This was an execution, carried out with the precision of an enemy who had studied the Jedi Order intimately, who understood its structure, its vulnerabilities, and its blind spots well enough to strike at the exact moment when resistance would prove most difficult to organize and most costly to sustain. Upon reaching Coruscant, Yoda's darkest fears found grim confirmation. The Jedi Temple, once a place of quiet contemplation and gathering wisdom stretching back countless generations, now stood as a site of horror, its corridors bearing evidence of violence that Yoda could scarcely bring himself to fully witness, even as decades of discipline forced him to press forward, seeking any survivors who might yet require rescue amid the devastation. He moved through familiar halls, transformed into scenes of unimaginable tragedy, past evidence that made unmistakably clear the identity, or at least the methods, of whoever had led this assault against the temple's remaining defenders. The style of destruction, the precision of the violence, all of it carried unmistakable hallmarks of a lightsaber wielded by someone intimately familiar with Jedi combat techniques, someone who had once called this temple home before turning against everything it represented. The full weight of this recognition settled over Yoda with crushing finality as he made his way deeper into the compromised temple, eventually encountering a security recording that confirmed what his instincts had already begun to suspect. With growing horror, the young Jedi he had watched grow from a frightened child into one of the Order's most celebrated warriors. The same Jedi whose volatile temperament and dangerous attachments had troubled Yoda's instincts for years, without ever receiving the direct intervention his concerns had warranted, had turned entirely to the dark side, leading this devastating assault against the very temple that had raised and trained him. Every warning Yoda had voiced, every subtle disturbance he had sensed, but failed to fully act upon, crystallized in this single, devastating moment of confirmation, a realization that carried with it not just grief, but a profound, personal weight of responsibility that Yoda would carry for the remainder of his long life. There was no time, however, for Yoda to fully process this crushing revelation amid the ongoing crisis still unfolding around him. Reaching out through the Force, he sensed the presence of his former Padawan, the Jedi Master who had trained this fallen warrior from childhood, now desperately searching the ruins of the temple in equal horror and disbelief. Together, briefly reunited amid catastrophe, the two masters shared the terrible confirmation of what had transpired, their long friendship now tested by grief and urgency in ways neither could have anticipated even during their darkest private conversations regarding the dangers they had both, in different ways, sensed building for years without fully understanding their true source or scope. With the temple compromised and Jedi forces devastated across the galaxy, Yoda made the difficult decision to divide their remaining efforts, recognizing that the crisis now extended in two distinct but interconnected directions, demanding immediate attention. His former Padawan would pursue the fallen Jedi directly, seeking to confront the source of the temple's destruction, and, if any hope remained, to somehow reach whatever fragment of goodness might still exist beneath the darkness that had consumed him. Yoda himself would turn his attention toward the source of the broader conspiracy, toward the hidden Sith Master whose patient scheming had orchestrated this entire catastrophe across years of careful, invisible manipulation. A figure Yoda now suspected, with dawning and horrifying certainty, occupied a position of trust and authority that had allowed him to operate entirely undetected at the very heart of Republic power. The confrontation that followed would test every ounce of skill, wisdom, and force mastery that Yoda had accumulated across his impossibly long life. Making his way into the highest chambers of Republic government, Yoda found himself face to face, at last, with the true architect of the galaxy's devastation, a figure whose public persona as a dedicated servant of the Republic had concealed, across years of intimate proximity to the Jedi Order itself, a Sith Lord of terrible power and patience. The revelation of this figure's true identity struck Yoda with a particular horror. Given how thoroughly this enemy had positioned himself within trusted political structures, how completely he had manipulated events across decades to engineer precisely the crisis now consuming the Jedi Order and transforming the Republic itself into something Yoda scarcely recognized. Their duel that followed would become, in the years and generations to come, one of the most legendary confrontations in the entire history of the Jedi and Sith, a clash between two beings whose combined mastery of the Force exceeded almost anything witnessed in living memory. Yoda fought with everything his centuries of discipline and wisdom had prepared him to offer, meeting his opponent's dark power with light forged through countless years of patient dedication to peace and balance. The battle raged through chambers, never designed to withstand such devastating displays of force-empowered combat, walls and structures crumbling around them as two masters of opposing philosophies fought not merely for personal survival, but for the fundamental question of which vision would ultimately shape the galaxy's future. For a time, the outcome remained genuinely uncertain, each combatant pressing the other to the absolute limits of their considerable power. Yoda drew upon reserves of strength and skill accumulated across a lifespan, far exceeding nearly any being he had ever encountered, meeting his enemy's aggressive, merciless assault with the kind of patient, adaptive resistance that had characterized his approach to every challenge throughout his entire existence. Yet even Yoda's extraordinary abilities eventually confronted a difficult and painful truth, one that would prove among the most significant realizations of his entire long life. Despite his mastery, despite his wisdom, despite centuries of accumulated experience, achieving outright victory in this particular confrontation remained beyond his reach. The dark power arrayed against him too deeply entrenched, too thoroughly prepared, to be overcome through direct confrontation alone in this singular moment. Faced with this sobering recognition, Yoda made the difficult choice to withdraw rather than continue a battle that risked not just his own destruction but the loss of whatever wisdom and perspective might yet prove essential to any hope of eventually restoring balance to a galaxy now plunged into darkness. This decision, made in the heat of desperate combat, would haunt Yoda in quieter moments throughout the years that followed. A choice that undoubtedly saved his life, yet also meant leaving the Republic and countless beings who had trusted the Jedi Order's protection to whatever fate this newly triumphant dark power intended to impose upon them. In the aftermath of this devastating confrontation, Yoda found himself among only a handful of Jedi who had survived the coordinated catastrophe that had claimed nearly the entirety of the Order across a single, terrible day. Reunited briefly with his former Padawan, whose own confrontation with their fallen brother had ended in tragedy and devastating personal loss, the two surviving masters faced together the almost unbearable task of determining what, if anything, remained of the Jedi Order's purpose and mission in a galaxy where the very institution they had served across countless generations now stood on the absolute edge of complete extinction. Their conversation in those grim, exhausted hours following such catastrophic loss would shape the remainder of both their lives, though the paths they chose to follow diverged significantly in the years ahead. Yoda, drawing upon wisdom accumulated across centuries of contemplating the deepest mysteries of the Force, began to perceive, even amid overwhelming grief, the outline of a longer, more patient strategy that might yet preserve some hope for eventual restoration of balance, though such hope would require sacrifices and choices more difficult than nearly anything either. Surviving Master had previously confronted throughout their long service to the Order they had both loved. Central to this emerging strategy was the fate of two children, born amid the chaos of this catastrophic transition, children whose parentage connected them directly to the very tragedy that had consumed the Jedi Order, and whose latent potential within the Force suggested they might yet play a crucial role in whatever distant future hope for restoration still remained possible. Yoda, along with his surviving colleagues, made the painful decision to separate these siblings, hiding each in circumstances designed to shield them from the attention of the dark power now ruling virtually unopposed across the galaxy, protecting them not through direct Jedi training, which would have marked them as targets for immediate discovery and elimination, but through careful, patient concealment that would allow them to grow toward maturity, far from the watchful eyes of an enemy who would surely seek to eliminate any remaining threat to his newly established dominance. This decision, agonizing in its implications, reflected the fundamental shift in strategy that would define the remainder of Yoda's long life following the catastrophe. No longer could the Jedi Order operate as the visible, institutionally supported guardians of peace and justice that had defined its role across countless preceding generations. Survival itself now demanded patience, concealment, and a willingness to accept that restoration of balance, if it came at all, would likely unfold across a timeline far longer than the immediate crisis currently gripping the galaxy. A timeline that might well extend beyond even Yoda's own considerably extended lifespan. With these difficult decisions made, and with the immediate danger of discovery pressing urgently upon him, Yoda made the choice to withdraw entirely from galactic affairs, seeking a place of exile remote and unremarkable enough to escape the attention of an enemy whose reach now extended across virtually every corner of civilized space. He chose a small, swamp-covered world far from established trade routes and centers of galactic power, a place whose very obscurity offered the best possible protection against discovery. However isolating and difficult such a choice would inevitably prove across the long years of solitude that stretched ahead of him. The years that followed brought Yoda into a form of existence utterly unlike anything he had experienced across his previous centuries of active service within the Jedi Order. Where once his days had been filled with teaching, diplomacy, military strategy, and constant engagement with the wider galaxy and its endless complications, his life now narrowed to the quiet, solitary rhythms of survival within a dense, challenging swamp environment that offered little in the way of comfort or convenience. he constructed a simple dwelling suited to his modest needs, learned to sustain himself through the limited resources his new environment provided, and settled into a solitude that, however difficult, also offered something he had rarely possessed throughout his centuries of constant service and responsibility, namely the uninterrupted time and space necessary for deep, sustained reflection upon everything that had transpired and everything that his long life had taught him about the true nature of the Force itself. This period of isolation, though undoubtedly painful in its separation from the wider galaxy and the causes he had dedicated his entire existence to serving, also became one of profound growth for Yoda, even amid the sorrow that never fully left him regarding the catastrophic losses he had witnessed and, in some measure, failed to prevent. Freed from the constant demands of council leadership and active military engagement, he found himself able to explore aspects of the Force that his previous responsibilities had never permitted sufficient time to fully investigate. He began to understand more deeply the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the Force, exploring teachings that hinted at the possibility of preserving identity and awareness even beyond the boundary of physical death. Ancient knowledge that had existed at the periphery of Jedi, understanding for generations, but had rarely received the sustained, focused attention that Yoda's current circumstances now allowed him to devote toward its careful study. Occasionally, across these long years of exile, Yoda sensed the presence of his fallen former Padawan, reaching out through the Force, offering fragments of forbidden knowledge regarding the very techniques for preserving consciousness beyond death that Yoda now found himself increasingly drawn toward exploring. This connection, maintained across the impossible distance separating the living from whatever existence this particular teacher now occupied, offered Yoda both comfort and profound complexity, a reminder that even amid tragedy and darkness, certain bonds and certain wisdom could persist in ways that defied easy categorization as purely good or purely corrupted by the shadow that had claimed so much else during the catastrophe that had reshaped the entire galaxy. Throughout these years of isolation, Yoda also maintained careful, distant awareness of the child he and his surviving colleagues had chosen to hide upon a remote desert world, watching from afar as this boy grew from infancy toward the threshold of adulthood, shielded by the ordinary rhythms of a simple life that gave no outward indication of the extraordinary destiny that patient, hidden forces continued to prepare him for. Whether he yet understood it or not, Yoda resisted every instinct urging more direct intervention, understanding that premature revelation risked drawing precisely the kind of dangerous attention that had already claimed so much, and that continued, even now, to search relentlessly for any remaining threat to the darkness now governing the galaxy in the Jedi Order's absence. The long-awaited moment of necessary intervention finally arrived when circumstances beyond Yoda's control brought this carefully protected young man into direct contact with the very legacy Yoda had spent decades protecting him from prematurely encountering. Guided toward Yoda's remote swamp world by the very former Padawan who had helped orchestrate this entire delicate strategy of concealment and patient waiting, the boy arrived, seeking training that would help him confront a growing awareness of his own significant role within a conflict that had, by this point, finally begun reigniting across the wider galaxy after decades of seemingly absolute darkness and oppression. Yoda's initial encounter with this long-awaited student unfolded with characteristic subtlety, the aged master choosing to observe and test the young man's character before revealing his true identity, evaluating not merely raw potential but the deeper qualities of patience, humility, and genuine commitment that Yoda's centuries of teaching experience had taught him mattered far more, in the end, than any measure of natural talent alone. What he found, upon completing this careful evaluation, brought both profound hope and considerable concern in roughly equal measure. The boy possessed genuine, significant connection to the Force, a legacy inherited directly from the father whose own tragic fall Yoda had witnessed and, in some measure, failed to prevent so many years earlier. Yet alongside this promising potential, Yoda also perceived troubling echoes of the very impatience and emotional volatility that had contributed to that earlier devastating fall, a recognition that filled the aged master with renewed determination to approach this training with far greater care and wisdom than circumstances had previously allowed him to exercise. The training that followed tested both master and student in ways that neither had fully anticipated when this long-delayed reunion of destiny finally began unfolding in earnest. Yoda found himself drawing upon every lesson accumulated across his impossibly long life, adapting teaching methods refined across centuries of guiding countless students toward greater wisdom and mastery, yet also recognizing that this particular student's circumstances, arriving for training as a young adult rather than as a small child free of prior attachments, demanded approaches that departed significantly from traditional Jedi practice. Time itself worked against them, the urgency of the wider galactic conflict pressing insistently against the patient, unhurried pace that ideal Jedi training would otherwise have followed. Despite these significant challenges, Yoda persisted with characteristic dedication, pouring the accumulated wisdom of his entire extraordinary life into preparing this young man for trials that Yoda understood. With the clarity born of decades spent contemplating the deepest patterns within the Force, would ultimately determine not just this individual student's fate, but quite possibly the fate of the entire galaxy's hope for eventual liberation from the darkness that had governed it for so long. He taught patience amid urgency, taught humility amid growing power, taught the crucial distinction between righteous conviction and the dangerous certainty that had, in different ways, contributed to the downfall of others Yoda had trained and cared for across his long centuries of service to the Jedi ideal. The training remained incomplete when circumstances beyond either master or student's control forced a premature departure, the young man's premonition of danger threatening those he loved, proving impossible for him to ignore despite Yoda's urgent counsel regarding the significant risks such premature confrontation with darkness posed to his prime. Still developing mastery and understanding, Yoda watched this departure with the particular sorrow of a teacher who recognized with painful clarity born from his own centuries of hard-won wisdom that his student was repeating patterns of impulsive attachment that had proven catastrophically costly once before, yet who also understood that ultimately each individual, regardless of how much guidance and wisdom a teacher might offer, must ultimately choose their own path and bear the consequences, whether triumphant or tragic, of decisions made according to their own developing judgment and character. In the time that followed this difficult departure, Yoda's own strength, already considerably diminished by the accumulated weight of centuries, far exceeding the natural lifespan of nearly any other species within the galaxy, began finally, inevitably, to fail. The long years of exile, the sustained grief carried since the catastrophic loss of nearly the entire Jedi Order, and the profound physical toll of drawing so extensively upon the Force, across such an extraordinarily extended existence, all converged at last, bringing Yoda to the recognition that his own time within physical form was drawing, at long last, toward its natural and inevitable conclusion. Sensing this approaching transition with the same calm acceptance that had characterized his response to nearly every challenge throughout his impossibly long existence, Yoda began preparing carefully for what he understood would be his final opportunity to pass along wisdom to the student whose training he had worked so hard to guide. However incomplete that training might ultimately remain given the accelerating pace of events unfolding across the wider galaxy. When his former Padawan returned once more to the remote swamp world, seeking guidance amid the mounting crisis that had brought his own student face to face with truths both wondrous and devastating regarding his heritage and the identity of the very enemy he had been called to confront, Yoda understood that the time for withholding difficult truths had finally, definitively, passed. Together, in what would prove to be among their final conversations, Yoda and his oldest surviving friend within the Order confronted questions that had lingered unresolved across decades of careful strategic concealment. The devastating revelation that the Dark Enforcer, now serving as the galaxy's most feared enforcer of oppressive rule, was, in fact, the very father of the young man they had trained and hoped might restore balance to a shattered galaxy, had already reached the ears of that young student through circumstances neither master had fully anticipated or controlled. This premature revelation, arriving amid confrontation rather than careful, patient instruction, troubled both surviving masters considerably, given how thoroughly it complicated the delicate balance of hope and caution they had worked so carefully to cultivate throughout their years of patient planning and hidden preparation. Yoda, drawing upon decades of contemplation regarding the true nature of the crisis facing this final hope for eventual restoration, offered counsel that reflected the full depth of wisdom accumulated across his extraordinarily long life. The path forward, he explained with characteristic directness, despite his physical weakness, would require their student to complete training, left painfully incomplete, to return to this same remote swamp world and finish the journey toward true mastery that circumstances had previously interrupted. Yet even as Yoda offered this guidance, he sensed with growing certainty that his own remaining time grew shorter with each passing moment. The accumulated weight of centuries, finally, inevitably, claiming the physical form that had carried him through so many trials, triumphs, and devastating losses across a lifespan that had stretched across ages of galactic history most beings could scarcely comprehend. In these final days, Yoda found himself reflecting deeply upon the entirety of his remarkably long existence, contemplating lessons learned across centuries of service, friendships forged and ultimately lost to tragedy, triumphs achieved through patience and wisdom, and failures that had haunted him despite his considerable accomplishments and undeniable wisdom. He thought often of the countless students he had trained across generations, of the friends who had fallen both in battle and to darkness, of the Order he had dedicated his entire existence to serving and protecting, an Order that now existed only in scattered fragments, hidden knowledge, and the patient hope he had worked so tirelessly to cultivate through the training of a new generation who might yet succeed where his own generation had ultimately fallen short. There was, in these final contemplative days, no bitterness in Yoda's reflection, no lingering resentment toward the fate that had brought him to this remote, isolated conclusion of an existence that had once stood at the very center of galactic affairs. Instead, he approached his approaching death with the same patient acceptance that had characterized his entire philosophy throughout centuries of teaching, understanding death not as an ending to be feared, but as a natural transition, a release of physical form that would allow his consciousness, refined through decades of careful study into the ancient techniques his fallen former student had first revealed to him, to persist within the Force itself, offering whatever continued guidance and support remained within his power, even after his physical presence finally departed from the galaxy he had served for so impossibly long. When his final student returned once more to complete the training so painfully interrupted by premature departure and devastating confrontation, Yoda welcomed him with the same warmth and patient wisdom that had characterized their earlier time together, though both master and student now understood, with unspoken but mutual clarity, that their remaining time together would prove tragically brief. Yoda used these final precious days to impart whatever additional wisdom his failing strength still permitted, addressing not just the technical aspects of Force mastery that remained incomplete, but the deeper philosophical questions his student continued to wrestle with regarding identity, heritage, and the terrible burden of confronting a father whose fall to darkness threatened to define the son's own understanding of his place within a legacy far more complicated than simple stories of heroes and villains could ever fully capture. In one of their final conversations, Yoda offered confirmation of the devastating truth his student had already learned through painful, direct confrontation, acknowledging without evasion or false comfort that the feared enforcer of oppressive rule was indeed the father whose identity had been carefully concealed across years of patient, strategic planning. Yet alongside this difficult confirmation, Yoda also offered something his student desperately needed in that moment of profound uncertainty, namely reassurance that this devastating heritage did not predetermine his own path or character, that the choices each individual made throughout their own life ultimately mattered more than whatever circumstances of birth or bloodline might suggest about their inevitable destiny. Yoda also used these final days to address another crucial truth that had remained carefully guarded across the preceding years of patient concealment, revealing to his student the existence of a sibling, a sister whose own hidden upbringing had shielded her, just as carefully as his own desert exile had shielded him. From the dangerous attention of the very darkness both siblings had ultimately been born to eventually confront, and Yoda hoped with whatever remaining strength his failing body still permitted him to muster, potentially help overcome through their combined efforts and complementary strengths. As his physical strength continued its inevitable decline, Yoda found himself confronting, in these final intimate moments, questions his student pressed regarding whether his training might finally be considered complete, whether sufficient preparation had been achieved to face the trials still awaiting him in his ongoing struggle against the darkness that had claimed both his father and so much of the galaxy across the preceding decades of oppressive rule. Yoda's response reflected the full depth of wisdom accumulated across his impossibly long teaching career, acknowledging that formal training, however important, could never fully substitute for the deeper understanding that could only emerge through lived experience, through the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences accepted across a lifetime of continued growth and reflection. In these final precious hours, surrounded by the simple, humble dwelling that had sheltered him across so many years of solitary exile, Yoda allowed himself, for perhaps the first time since the catastrophic loss of nearly the entire Jedi Order so many years earlier, to speak openly regarding the full weight of failures and regrets that had accumulated across his extraordinarily long life. He acknowledged, with characteristic honesty rather than self-pity, the ways in which his own caution and hesitation, however understandable given the circumstances he had faced, had nonetheless contributed to tragedies that a more decisive intervention might conceivably have prevented. Yet even in this candid acknowledgement of his own limitations, Yoda offered his student a final, crucial lesson regarding the nature of wisdom itself, namely that true mastery lay not in achieving flawless judgment across every circumstance, but in maintaining the humility and openness necessary to continue learning and growing, even after centuries of accumulated experience and hard-won understanding. As his final moments approached, Yoda spoke of one last crucial truth that he had come to understand only gradually across his many years of careful, patient study. Following the catastrophic devastation that had claimed the Jedi Order and scattered its remaining survivors across the galaxy in hidden exile, the path toward true balance and restoration, he explained, would require his student to move beyond the more rigid interpretations of Jedi philosophy that Yoda's own generation had, in retrospect, adhered to, perhaps too inflexibly, contributing in subtle but significant ways to the very vulnerabilities that had ultimately allowed catastrophe to unfold. True wisdom, Yoda counseled with his remaining strength, would require synthesis rather than rigid adherence to established doctrine, a willingness to learn from failure and adapt understanding even when such adaptation challenged deeply held assumptions accumulated across generations of established tradition and teaching. With these final teachings offered, Yoda allowed his physical form, weakened beyond recovery by the accumulated weight of centuries far exceeding the natural span of nearly any other being he had encountered across his impossibly long existence, to finally release its hold on the material world. In his final moments, surrounded by the student whose training represented both the culmination of decades of patient, careful planning and the fragile hope for eventual restoration that had sustained Yoda through so many years of difficult, isolated exile, he spoke his final words with the same characteristic blend of humor and profound wisdom that had defined his teaching style across countless generations of students throughout his remarkably long life. As his physical form gently faded, dissolving into the Force itself rather than leaving behind the kind of remains that typically marked the conclusion of a mortal life, Yoda achieved at last the culmination of decades spent carefully studying the ancient techniques his fallen former student had first revealed to him during those long years of solitary exile. His consciousness, rather than simply ceasing with the failure of his physical body, persisted within the Force itself, joining the small number of other Jedi who had similarly mastered this rare and precious technique, achieving a form of continued existence that would allow him to offer guidance and presence to future generations, even without the constraints and limitations of physical form. In the days and years that followed his physical death, Yoda's presence within the Force continued to offer guidance to the student whose training he had worked so tirelessly to complete, appearing at crucial moments to offer counsel, encouragement, and the particular blend of wisdom and gentle humor that had characterized his teaching throughout his entire, extraordinarily long life. This continued presence proved crucial during the climactic confrontations that finally brought the long struggle against galactic tyranny to its ultimate conclusion, as Yoda's former student drew upon lessons learned both during his physical training and through these continued spiritual visitations to finally achieve the restoration and redemption that Yoda himself had worked so patiently across so many difficult years to make possible. The ultimate triumph that followed, achieved through a combination of skill, wisdom, and the crucial recognition that compassion and connection could accomplish what pure confrontation and aggression never could, represented the fulfillment of hopes Yoda had carried since those darkest days of catastrophic loss so many years earlier. The redemption of the very Father, whose fall had once seemed to represent the Jedi Order's most devastating failure, became, in the end, part of the restoration Yoda had worked so tirelessly across his final years to help make possible, a full circle of loss and recovery that reflected the deepest truths Yoda had spent his entire impossibly long life coming to understand regarding the fundamental nature of balance, redemption, and the enduring power of hope, even amid seemingly insurmountable darkness. In the years that followed this ultimate restoration of balance, Yoda's spirit continued to offer guidance to subsequent generations who took up the work of rebuilding what catastrophe had once nearly destroyed entirely. His teachings, preserved both through direct spiritual guidance and through the accumulated wisdom he had imparted across his centuries of active teaching before his physical death, became foundational texts for a new generation of Force-sensitive students seeking to understand not just the technical mastery of their abilities, but the deeper philosophical wisdom regarding patience, humility, and genuine understanding that Yoda had spent his entire existence striving to embody and impart to those fortunate enough to learn directly from his guidance. Looking back across the full sweep of Yoda's extraordinary existence, from his mysterious, unknown origins through centuries of dedicated service, from the golden age of a flourishing republic through its catastrophic collapse, from the depths of isolated exile through the final fulfillment of hopes carefully nurtured across decades of patient waiting, a singular truth emerges that Yoda himself would likely have identified as the essential lesson of his impossibly long life. Wisdom, true wisdom, is not measured merely in accumulated years or acquired knowledge, however considerable either might become across a lifespan as extraordinary as his own. True wisdom lies instead in the patient, humble willingness to keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing in the possibility of restoration and redemption, even when circumstances seem most thoroughly to suggest that such hope has become impossible to sustain. Yoda's story, spanning centuries that witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the near destruction and eventual restoration of an ancient order dedicated to preserving balance and justice throughout the galaxy, and the patient cultivation of hope across even the darkest possible circumstances, offers a testament to the enduring power of wisdom tempered by humility, of strength expressed through patience rather than dominance, and of faith maintained not through certainty but through the persistent, disciplined choice to continue believing in the possibility of goodness even when evidence for such belief seems most thoroughly obscured by surrounding darkness. In this way, the small, unassuming figure who first arrived at the Jedi Temple as a child from a world no one could quite remember or locate, ultimately became something far greater than any single measure of power or accomplishment could ever fully capture. a living embodiment of the very balance and wisdom he had spent his entire extraordinary existence teaching others to seek within themselves. And so the story of Master Yoda comes to its quiet conclusion, not with the grandeur of victory parades or monuments raised in his honor, but with something far more fitting to the life he lived, a continued, gentle presence within the Force itself, offering patient guidance to those still finding their own way through the complicated, ever-unfolding balance between light and darkness that will continue, as it always has, to shape the endless unfolding story of the galaxy he loved and served across a lifetime longer, wiser, and more quietly extraordinary than nearly any other, being fortunate enough to walk among the stars, before finally settling into the isolated swamp world that would become his home for so many long years of solitary exile. Yoda's initial flight from the catastrophe engulfing the galaxy carried him first to a very different kind of refuge. A lush, forested world inhabited by a proud and ancient species whose deep loyalty to the Republic had made them staunch allies throughout the preceding years of devastating warfare. There, amid towering trees that stretched toward the sky in ways that echoed, in their own quiet grandeur, something of the patient endurance Yoda himself had come to embody across his own centuries of existence, he found brief but crucial assistance from beings whose courage and loyalty had not wavered even as the wider galaxy descended into chaos and betrayal all around them. Among these steadfast allies, Yoda encountered a particular warrior whose bravery and skill left a lasting impression despite the brevity of their time together. Amid the desperate circumstances of Yoda's continued flight from forces now actively hunting any remaining Jedi who had somehow survived the initial catastrophic betrayal. Together, they fought against clone forces who had turned, just as those elsewhere across the galaxy had turned, against the very Jedi they had so recently served alongside in loyal partnership. This brief but intense collaboration reinforced something Yoda had already begun to understand with growing clarity amid the devastation surrounding him, namely that loyalty and goodness had not vanished entirely from the galaxy, despite the overwhelming darkness now threatening to consume everything the Jedi Order had worked so long to protect and preserve. It was only after securing safe passage away from this forested world, evading pursuit through careful use of both Force-guided instinct and the practical assistance of allies whose courage had proven crucial to his continued survival, that Yoda finally made his way toward the remote, swamp-covered world that would become his true and lasting place of exile across the long years that followed. This choice of destination reflected careful calculation rather than mere desperate flight. Yoda, recognizing that true, lasting concealment required a location so thoroughly disconnected from established trade routes and centers of galactic attention that even the most determined and resourceful pursuit would struggle to locate him amid its dense, challenging terrain and its almost complete absence of any strategic or economic significance that might otherwise draw unwanted attention from an enemy whose reach now extended with troubling thoroughness across nearly every corner of civilized space. The daily rhythms of this long exile settled, over time, into patterns that would have seemed almost unimaginable to those who had known Yoda during his centuries of active leadership within the bustling, consequential halls of the Jedi Temple and the Republic Senate, where once his days had been structured around council deliberations, diplomatic negotiations, and the constant demands of training new generations of Jedi. His existence now narrowed to the simple, essential tasks of survival within a challenging natural environment that offered little in the way of comfort or convenience. He learned to identify which of the swamp's abundant plant life offered nourishment and which posed danger, learned to navigate the treacherous, ever-shifting terrain of bog and root system that characterized his new home, and gradually adapted his considerable physical capabilities, honed across centuries of combat and physical discipline, toward the more modest but no less demanding challenges of simple survival in relative isolation. Yet even amid this dramatically reduced circumstance, Yoda never fully abandoned the disciplined practices that had defined his entire existence as a Jedi. He maintained rigorous meditation schedules, continuing to seek deeper understanding of the Force, even without students to guide or counsel deliberations to inform. He practiced, in solitude, the physical forms of lightsaber combat that had served him so well across countless battles throughout his long life, ensuring that his skills remained sharp despite the absence of any immediate need for their application within his current circumstances of quiet, patient waiting. This continued discipline reflected something essential about Yoda's character, a fundamental belief that growth and preparation remained meaningful pursuits even, perhaps especially, during periods when their practical application seemed most distant and uncertain. The isolation of these years also brought Yoda into closer, more sustained contact with the native creatures who shared his adopted swamp world, small and large alike, whose simple, instinctive relationship with their environment offered its own quiet lessons regarding patience, adaptation, and the fundamental interconnectedness that Jedi philosophy had always taught, but that Yoda now found himself experiencing with a directness and immediacy that his previous, more consequential responsibilities had rarely permitted him to fully appreciate. He came to know the particular rhythms of this world intimately, its seasonal patterns, its subtle dangers, and its unexpected moments of quiet beauty that offered brief respite from the grief and uncertainty that continued to weigh upon him even across the passing years of continued exile. Throughout this extended period of isolation, Yoda also devoted considerable attention to organizing and preserving whatever fragments of Jedi wisdom and history he could recall from memory, understanding that with the temple's archives destroyed or scattered and so many knowledgeable masters lost to the catastrophic betrayal, his own accumulated knowledge represented an increasingly precious and irreplaceable repository of understanding that future generations, should any opportunity for restoration ever arise, would desperately need in order to rebuild what had been so thoroughly and deliberately destroyed. He spent long hours recording these memories and teachings through whatever limited means his isolated circumstances permitted, creating a kind of living archive that existed nowhere but within his own carefully disciplined memory and occasional written fragments, preserved against the considerable uncertainty of whether such knowledge would ever again find students capable of receiving and applying it toward genuine restoration. As the years of exile continued to accumulate, Yoda occasionally permitted himself brief, carefully guarded excursions beyond the immediate boundaries of his swamp refuge, always exercising extreme caution to avoid any possibility of detection by the forces that continued, even after so many years, to search for remaining threats to the darkness now governing the galaxy. In the Jedi Order's continued absence, these rare excursions offered Yoda glimpses of how thoroughly the wider galaxy had transformed during his isolation, glimpses that brought fresh grief regarding the suffering and oppression that had become commonplace under the new order of governance that had replaced the republic he had served for so many centuries, yet also occasional glimmers of the same quiet courage and goodness he had witnessed among his allies during that initial desperate flight from catastrophe, reminders that the light he had dedicated his entire existence to protecting had not been entirely extinguished, despite the overwhelming darkness now dominating galactic affairs. It was during one such careful, limited excursion, undertaken specifically to seek counsel from another surviving Jedi Master, whose own path through the catastrophic transition had led towards similarly isolated but geographically distant exile, that Yoda engaged in extended philosophical discussions that would significantly shape his evolving understanding regarding the ultimate strategy required to eventually restore balance to a galaxy still suffering under oppressive rule. These discussions, conducted with characteristic patience and mutual respect between two masters who had each, in their own way, survived catastrophic loss and adapted their understanding of Jedi philosophy in response to failures that neither could fully have anticipated during their earlier, more confident years of active service. Within the thriving, established order they had both once called home. Together, these two surviving masters gradually developed the outline of a patient, long-term strategy centered upon the eventual training of the hidden children whose protection had become the primary remaining hope for any future restoration of balance. This strategy required tremendous patience, a willingness to wait not merely years, but potentially decades, allowing these carefully protected children to reach full maturity and develop sufficient wisdom and stability of character before any direct training could safely begin, without risking the same kind of premature exposure and catastrophic vulnerability that had characterized the training of the very Jedi, whose eventual fall had contributed so significantly to the Order's original catastrophic destruction. Returning once more to his isolated swamp refuge following these crucial strategic discussions, Yoda settled back into the familiar rhythms of solitary exile with renewed sense of purpose, understanding now more clearly than ever before that his own continued survival and preparation served a crucial function within a larger strategy that extended far beyond his own individual circumstances, or even his own considerably extended natural lifespan. He continued his careful, patient observation of the hidden children's continued development from the safe distance his exile necessarily required, drawing quiet satisfaction and cautious hope from indications that both were growing toward the kind of character and stability that might eventually prove capable of sustaining the tremendous responsibility that patient planning continued to prepare them for, whether they yet understood the full scope of their eventual destiny or not. The decades continued to accumulate with the same patient inevitability that had characterized so much of Yoda's remarkably extended existence, each passing year bringing him closer to the eventual moment when circumstances would finally align to bring his carefully protected students into direct contact with the training and guidance that patient decades of preparation had worked so tirelessly to make possible. Throughout this extended waiting, Yoda never wavered in his fundamental commitment to the strategy he and his surviving colleague had so carefully developed, maintaining his disciplined isolation and continued preparation even as the physical toll of such extended solitary existence, combined with the already extraordinary weight of centuries accumulated well before this final period of exile even began, gradually began exacting its own inevitable cost upon his remarkable but ultimately finite physical vitality. And so, across centuries that began with a small, mysterious child arriving at the doorstep of an ancient order he could not yet fully comprehend, and concluding with a spirit dissolved gently into the very force that had guided every choice throughout his impossibly long existence, Yoda's story remains, even now, one of the most quietly profound reminders that true strength lies not in size, not in certainty, and not even in victory itself, but in the patient, humble willingness to keep believing, keep learning, and keep hoping. No matter how long the darkness might stretch before the light finally, inevitably, finds its way home again.